Welcome everyone to the Hobby Desk. So today I thought I would try my hand at making some Aeronautica Imperialis terrain. So what do I mean by terrain for this game? In a game where you don't need terrain, you don't need terrain, funny enough. They do have ground assets, so you play certain missions and you have like flat cannons and things like that you need to take out. Now that's fine and bombing runs are okay and everything. And these boards do look nice. This is the Rins World board, which looks nice, and it's the cardboard, thicker board, and it's a bigger board than the sheets you get in the core boxes. And they're great, they really are, and they have some brilliant levels of detail. But I've always thought, why not make the table a bit more interesting? And I do like terrain on all the games I play. For me, terrain building and painting and assembling and customizing, especially making stuff from scratch. If you haven't seen my previous videos, I do like to make terrain by scratch. In fact, 9-inch Charge Dan from the 9-inch Charge YouTube channel has actually started calling me the Terrain MacGyver, which I love. I think that's fantastic. Thank you very much, Dan. If you haven't seen his videos, please check them out. Massively into Warhammer Fantasy and AOS. If that's your bag, definitely check him out. Such a nice guy. Such a nice guy. So, I've always wanted to know what kind of rules I could do for these terrain pieces. So I'm thinking canyon style terrain. Now it would be nice to have a full-blown 3D board, like Top Gun or something, and flying through these canyons. It would be amazing. The trouble is, even though the planes are on a ball and you can swivel the planes and everything, I don't think the models would stay on the terrain. They would fall over and tip off. So all I'm going to do is add the occasional spire and like spine of a mountain on a few of these hexes. Now I could just make a couple of blobs of cork and things like that, and that's fine, or expanding foam and paint them up. Okay, whatever. But to make it look like more in keeping with the game, I'm going to base them on hexes. So I was racking my brain, what kind of thing can I do? I can't really draw numbers on the side of a mountain. It doesn't look very realistic. You can always put a token next to it, I suppose. But along comes the Aeronautica Imperialis Companion. So this book here, which is a brilliant read. It has additional rules. It has more rules for planes, upgrades, things like that. But in the back, it has a terrain section. And I thought, oh, this would be brilliant. Just what I wanted. So rather than making up some rules for terrain, someone's already done it. But it is quite a small section. So basically it implies that you could, if you wanted to, make a hill. For example, it may be altitude 1 or 2. So there's nothing really fixed in stone, whilst a mountain or any other terrain feature may be as high as altitude 3 or 4. So they do suggest you can always fly over it. That being great and everything, it is a bit skimping on the rules, but that's the kind of thing I had in my mind. So I'm glad Games Workshop and myself agree. But being mainly an orc player, terrain feature of 4, I definitely can't fly over. Orcs generally wouldn't care about that. They would just fly into it because they're crazy. They don't care, and it's a very fun game. I'm not using this for competition, but I thought I would make some mountain pieces, height 3, so at least everybody can fly over it. So what am I doing with the old Rins World board? This is the board we use a lot of the time on the YouTube channel, and on the other side it has kind of like the city kind of feel to it, and mountains really wouldn't work with that. So I'm using it on this side at the moment just so I can get a rough colour match when I start spraying up my pieces of the terrain. But what I'm going to start is the base. It's always good to start from the bottom, work your way up, isn't it? So I've got some good old plastic card. And it looks like foam core, but it is actually a plastic card. Relatively easy to cut, but very, very durable. And I want to make a few templates and start cutting out some pieces for that. So you could use card if you want to keep the cost down. That's not a problem. Corrugated card, obviously you can see corrugations in the side, so you might want to fill those in. But this stuff is brilliant. Or you could always use a nice chunk of cork, because it's going to look like rock, right? So why not base it on something that looks like rock? But for me, I'm going to put them on something that's pretty much the same thickness as the actual plane bases themselves, so they're not out of keeping. So I'll start doing that. I'll draw around some of the hexes and start making some bases. You don't need to see me cut it. You can probably work out by yourself how to cut things. If you're using cardboard, scissors are good, but always have a nice sharp knife, cut away from yourself when you can. So to make the templates, here's your base, and if you're very careful, screwdriver or a fairly thick stone knife blade, you can just pop the tab one side and stab myself on camera. It would be amazing. That'll get some views, right? And pop on the other side. So just take note, altitude and speed. So obviously speed is 0 to 9, altitude is 1 to 5. So I'll just put those over to one side, and I'm going to be using this section because it's smaller, this section because it's got no tabs, whereas this section does. So it's approximately the right size for the hexes. So I'll cut a few of those out. So I've cut out a few, and I have sanded the edges because the actual bases are slightly curved. So there is no defined points. So that's pretty good. I mean, it doesn't have to be 100%, but that's pretty good. And now I'm going to start sticking with some super glue, some pieces of cork, building up, and once it's fully dry, here comes the fun bit, start tearing off the chunks of cork, making it look a bit more realistic. Now, you can make these as pointed as you like, just bear in mind, if you make them extremely pointy, ships can't stop on them. So if you're making it, let's say, a size 4, ships are either going to crash into it or they're going to be on top of it. So you can take the ship off and put it on the piece of terrain, not a problem. Just remember what height the ships are at. If it's, let's say, a height 2 piece of terrain and you're resting the ship on top, then you're going to have to remember or put a token next to, because if you rest the base on top of the mountain with the model on it, chances are you're going to knock it off. And if it is quite pointy, let's say it's approximately this size point, imagine him balancing something like that on it, it's going to teeter off. So it's better to have a relatively fat top and nice and flat with the cork so you can rest your planes on. Less likely to fall off. It may happen still, but it's less likely. So in our one of our previous battle reports, Marcus had made cotton clouds, which isn't a problem because you can put the clouds on top of the planes, so it looks like the plane is actually in the cloud. But when it comes to a mountain, mountains generally don't rest on top of planes. If they do, planes aren't going very far. So the super glue I'm using is just a really cheap super glue. Now I do prefer, me personally, in little plastic bottles rather than those foil little packets, because if you keep them on the side for a couple of weeks, you try to use them again, they split, they tear open, you start wearing super glue. I get enough glue myself, I don't really need help. So I generally use these little plastic ones, so you can just put a pin in the end and clear it out if you need to. But I'm going to start making some basic shapes. So generally speaking, the base of the mountain is thicker than the top. So I'm going to just, you might want to put some newspaper or something down. Or in my case, I'm using a chopping mat. And I am going to start sticking these on like so. And working my way up, getting thinner and thinner as I go. So I'm using cork because cork gives quite a realistic rocky texture, and you can always tear bits off, and it's pretty durable. If you do need to sand it, you can sand it as well, but things like EVA foam isn't too bad either, that's quite durable. If you use like extruded foam, just be very careful what you're spraying it with because it could well melt. And if you use things like Celotex, Celotex is quite soft. If you're like me and you go club to club or go to different shows and things like that, it may not last very well. So several coats PVA is great for that stuff. Me personally, I like to use cork. I picked up 12 sheets, foot by foot, in my local DIY centre. Relatively cheap. I say relatively cheap because it does last for quite some time. It's great for making buildings and things like that, but I think it worked out maybe £1.50 per sheet, but when you buy it in bulk, things generally are cheaper. And like I said, it just lasts forever. You know, you're going to use it on several hobby projects, so it's not that expensive. And that's me saying that, and I'm tight. So I'm going to start adding more and more pieces and stacking these up. So that's the basic shape. I mean, you can make it as tapered as you like. I'm making it relatively flat on the top because, like I said, when my planes are flying over, I want the bases to be pretty secure. And with some big bombers out there, you really don't want them to tip over. But it's totally up to you. If you want to build it up, taper it a little bit more, it's totally fine. You could even drill a small hole and put take the plane off and put it in the hole, so it's less likely to fall over when it flies over. Not a problem. But for me, I want it more realistic. So rather than having a number on the top or a hole in the top, I just do it like this. Not a problem. I'm adding 3 because the rules that I'm going to use for the terrain, so it's completely home brewed, is roll D3, and the person who has the priority roll places the first one, then their opponent, and then back to them again, if there is indeed 3 on the table. Because I think any more than 3 is probably a bit excessive, especially on those bombing runs. But you don't have to use D3. You can always use any terrain rules that you want to make up, as long as your opponent's completely fine with it. So if you want to do a D6, or if you just want to do a flat 6, or whatever like that, this is just my homebrewed rules. A little bit of a twist on the book, on the companion book. And like I said, it's not that clear. It's fairly vague. But like I said, it's a game you don't need the terrain in. Just adds a little something. And to reflect a size 5 piece of terrain, I would recommend putting a point on it, just to show that you cannot land a plane on it, because nothing can go higher than size 5. But like I said, you literally can make any rock shape you want. I'm just going to make it slightly more playable, so it's less likely to knock over. And then when it comes to painting and texture, I love this stuff. So I'll pan out a bit with the camera, because you don't want to get that close, do you? Has to make a noise when you pan out. Right, so this stuff is Mig Concrete. So they do loads of different textures. Mig, they do like tarmac and mud and all sorts. Brilliant it is. It's basically the equivalent of GW's concrete aggregate, but it's 10 times the size for only twice the price. So yeah, it might be about £10, but you think how long that's going to last. So you could use that stuff, for example, to fill in all the cracks, or you can paint over the whole thing. It's totally up to you. I am going to fill in a few of the cracks, because like the top bit there, I think it's a bit too cracked for my personal taste. It's totally up to you. Don't have to use that at all. You can just use sand and PVA. Sand and super glue goes off a lot quicker. But if you are going to drill it and put rods and things like that, don't use sand and super glue, because it will kill drill bits. It's super, super tough. But yeah, I'm just going to give it a little bit of texture before I prime up with a nice cheapy rattle can. So just to seal it in, and then I'm going to start painting it up. So I'm using an airbrush purely because it's quicker and a little bit smoother. But it doesn't really matter because the surface is quite rough anyway. So that's the 3 pieces I've done, approximately of the same height. And I've kept them flat on the top, like I said, because I want to put the planes on so they don't tip over. So in future, what I might do is make a piece half the height of this, and then I can say that is size 1 possibly. I can make these size 2. I could always put a counter on them to say what height I want them to be. But I wanted them so I could put them as a mountain or leave them individual. And I've painted them these colours to kind of match the boards that I've got for Ray's World. So I don't want them to be exactly the same because they won't stand out very well on camera. So obviously I want to keep these for our battle reports. So I'll just place them down like that, just to show. So I'm going to place them down. And I'll just put one over here. Like so. So yeah, I wanted them to be a similar kind of paint scheme, but if you're not using these mattes, you're using the ones straight out of the box, obviously they're a different colour, and paint them up any way you want. And like I would ideally like to do, is to make a canyon run. But like I said, I don't think the planes would stand up right, they'd probably tip over. But yeah, I mean, the rules are pretty vague for terrain in this game, and like I said, you don't need terrain. It does look cool, and it just adds a little bit of something different. If you don't play with the ground defences, I do find you're flying at height 4 and 5 quite a lot, unless you're really in trouble and you try to dive away from your opponent and try to survive. But it just adds a little something to the game. Makes it a little bit more interesting. Not that the game's not interesting as it is. Aeronautica is great, it really is fantastic. But there is no terrain, and for me personally, I do like terrain in my games. I was contemplating and doing single sheet cork for each level, maybe putting a magnet or something on the cork bases, and you can hide it underneath a bit of sand or something so that the magnet isn't obvious. And like those stackable primary school kind of kids toys, like kindergarten toys, with the donuts or the pyramids, and you can stack up, and each stack is slightly smaller. I was thinking about doing that kind of thing. Large cork, smaller cork, smaller cork, smaller cork, smaller cork, and you can just keep adding to it. Or you can just make something that looks more cone-like, something with a definitive point, just to show you can't land a plane on here. So that's definitely size 5. But the choice is up to you. This is just a guideline on how I make my terrain for Aeronautica Imperialis. But yeah, you can shape them any way you want them to be, and make them a bit more realistic. But I like to make them a little bit realistic and a little bit useful, so like I said, so they don't tip off at the top. But thank you very much for watching this video, guys. Hope you found this interesting. Please hit that like button if you haven't done already. And please subscribe for some more great content. And hopefully you'll see these terrain pieces on our battle report soon. So stay tuned. Take it easy, everyone, and stay safe.